All right, James, we will get started. We've got a little group here, and we just want to ask your permission if we could record this today, that we could post on our website later on. I know that there are a lot of students who wanted to check in, but there were conflicts with their schedules, so perhaps they can view it afterwards. Is that okay?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, great. And then we also, towards the end of the chat, we will pass along your email address and contact if there's any students that specifically want to ask questions that weren't able to make it today too.
Sounds good.
All right, well, thank you so much for being with us. And firstly, I'm really sorry to hear about your grandma. I'm glad that she, lived a life full of zest, and it sounds, according to Vicky, that she had quite an impact. So that's great. We thank you for being here today. And you remember Joanne, you'll probably remember a lot of the names that you see on screen, and Vicky, of course. But we're happy to have you here and to hear about your journey and what brought you out to Vancouver, what put you into economic development. And I just did when I looked you up on the web earlier, just to get a little bit more info, I see that you're a self-proclaimed news junkie, data nerd, and sports enthusiast.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. So we look forward to hearing from you. And if you want to start and tell us, I guess, your journey as early as you want. If you want to start an undergrad or even high school. I know that we've got a lot of students that are trying to think about different careers and navigate their own journey. So hearing from alumni is always really helpful.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. And I guess not to go into my life story, but when I was in high school, probably like many people, I had no idea what I was going to do. And but sport was my passion, and at that time, it was I still do, but I was a sailing coach for a community sport organization. So not like a yacht club; it offers affordable programs to youth within what we call the Tri-Cities community, so like a metro suburb of Vancouver. And that kind of drove me to go into my UBC. So I'm from Vancouver, and focus on kinesiology. So I wanted to be a physiotherapist, and had a bit of probably a pre-quarter life crisis. I took a year off and traveled the world, and I worked with some physiotherapists in Kenya with distance runners. And I realized I don't want to be a physiotherapist, but I was more interested in kind of the sociology behind why these athletes, team runners, and life and the politics involved in being an amateur athlete or going into the Olympics. So when I went back to university, restarted my studies, I took a course on Olympic history, and that just kind of and sport totally changed my worldview about sport. And I read one of Vicky's articles. She was in Sport and Peace by Brian Wilson from UBC. I thought wow, that's really cool. Like this hope and strength perspective. Like I would like to learn more. So I reached out to Vicky when I was an undergrad. We connected, and long story short, I ended up in Windsor. But at the time, I knew nothing about Windsor, and so it was different for me. But I got to say, overall, it was a great experience. Not just the school itself, but the graduate community and living in the city itself really opened my eyes up to a different type of urban center. And just having the proximity, so being so close to the U.S., also opened my eyes to different things. So, I did a thesis at Windsor. So I did 3 courses plus an independent study with Marika Tax, who's now at Ottawa. And I kind of was on 2 different branches. One, I was really interested in the social and economic impacts of international sport events. But my thesis research really revolved around an adaptive sailing program for people with disabilities. And kind of what drew me towards that is not just working with Vicky, but also from my background. It was something that I felt I had to give in terms of coaching, and I wanted to just give back to my community, broader sailing community, and learn something new, same, but different. So my thesis focused on the experience of those participants and volunteers. And it was incredibly rewarding, definitely changed my life. And right out of grad school, I got a job with Freestyle Ski Canada. So I moved back out here to Vancouver, and I worked with Freestyle Canada for a couple of years, and got pretty in depth into the Canadian sports system. So I learned how everything funding works between Canadian Olympic Committee on the podium, grassroots program, sport development, and working with the provincial territories, the provinces, the PSOs and TPSOs, and implementing and evaluating long-term athlete development frameworks, but also coaching frameworks and or official and judged guideways, and just how the sports system works. So while I was doing that, I had a lot of opportunities to travel and present at national conferences. So that was one of the things I really liked about doing in Windsor, was presenting at conferences. And this just happened to be in more professional setting, let's just say. So, I'd meet the Basketball Canada and, Racquetball Canada, and we'd talk about how to best implement the LTAD strategies. And from that, opportunities arose for me to do some contract work with Canada Sport for Life. So for those that aren't aware, they're the governing group that developed the long-term athlete development framework and works with the NSOs and to implement it. So I worked on a project to measure and track the implementation of different frameworks. So like comp dev frameworks, LTAD, coaching, based on every single NSO, and develop an index. And then that index was shared with Sport Canada to show how the sports system was progressing. And then I also had the opportunity to go out to Greece for 2 weeks to the International Olympic Academy. And Marika Tax was actually just there the week before me, and Elena Parent, for people that know, was there at the same time. So it was cool to catch up. And I was a Canadian delegate, and I worked with, there was about, I think, over 100 different delegates from, I think, 100 something different countries. So like the Chinese Olympic Committee, the Israeli Olympic Committee, so on and so forth. And it was a 2-week session. And we basically, the theme was on sports governance. And we wrote 3 intercultural papers as a group, which is interesting. You're dealing with, people that governance is not really a thing, and where they're from. And it was more of a cultural experience. And a part of that is I worked with the Canadian Olympic Committee to develop educational resources for their school programs. But alas, I didn't. I stayed with Freestyle Canada for 3 years. So when the Olympics ended, I was looking to do something different. So something more within my community. So maybe before I jumped, so I started working with the Downtown Vancouver Business Improvement Association. My position never existed before. That was the first, it was just my first day. It was I'm at the office now, so I'm not sure who can hear me, but it was, I kind of sat down, and this is what, at a high level, what we need, and can you do it? So my kind of research areas pre-pandemic were looking at crime safety. So I was working with Vancouver Coastal Health and the Provincial Health Authority to track needle collection. And then so I would track needles based on this database, and I could pinpoint hot spots. And then I would work with those authorities to advocate for more social support, or our group would advocate for more social support, more needle collection boxes. Opioid crisis is a big issue in Vancouver. More, social housing, so on and so forth. And then, we also do look at what's going on in the economy to support specifically independent street level businesses. That's a whole nother can of worms to open up with the pandemic. But so that's what I do for work. But I've also been volunteering with or I still do to a certain extent, with the Rocky Point Sailing Association. So that's where I grew up sailing. So since I was 11 years old, and you know, some of those guys that were on that board were in their late 70s. So they asked if I would take on what they call the Commodore position, so chair of the meetings. And I did that for 4 years, and it was a really, really rewarding experience. But when the pandemic hit, obviously it was very, very challenging. Um, you know, like I learned a lot, and we worked together to, you know, get access to government supports that I'm sure most of us are aware of, keep the club going, mentor our sailing directors to make sure our programs are physically distant, they're socially distanced and safe. And so that's one thing I volunteered with. The other one, since, as I said, my thesis essentially changed my worldview and my life in a way, and I continue to volunteer. It's been over 5 years now with the adaptive sailing program in Vancouver, which I really enjoy because all I got to do is show up and I meet a new person and either take them sailing or they take me sailing. And it's just a cool, really, it's a gift, you know, that they're giving me. I learn something new each time. Based on that, volunteer experience from my work experience, I got someone from Whistler Adaptive Sports reached out to me and they asked if I wanted to join their board of directors. So I did that in October. So a big part of that will be kind of cleaning up their systems to make sure that people aren't getting left out, and really navigating the pandemic right now, and ensuring, as we know, sport's so important to so many people, but especially people with disabilities can feel very isolated in times like these. So that's a big focus that we're working on right now. So I'm on the strategic planning task force and the governance committee. I know I just unloaded a lot. I'm not sure you have any questions. If there's anything you want to hear about I'm working on now.
That was great, James. Thank you for that. And I appreciate how you kind of built on each of your experiences and took that skill set and brought you to where you are now, which, you know, I never would have anticipated that experience in sailing and economic impact of sporting events. And now you're with the Vancouver Business Development talking about safety and needle tracking and collection. I mean, I think it just shows how you can gain skills, collect those skills or those tools for your toolbox at each of those spots that you've been, and take experiences, whether it was volunteering or whether it was paid positions, and transfer it to something that is very different.
Yeah, I think my greatest learning in the past couple of years is, so most people think I'm an urban planner or have a master's in public policy. And this isn't the first talk I've done like this. And people are always surprised that it's sport management. But I think it's really good if you're a student in sport management is you get that conceptual framework of how things are. But it's really important to supplement that with digital skills training, especially in the pandemic. And that's what a lot of what economists and Conference Board of Canada and Stats Canada is saying, is that to really find a job in today's economy, you need digital skills training. So for me, that happened when I was working at Freestyle, and it happened through a random professional development opportunity through the Canadian Olympic Committee. So I went up to Calgary, and it was a group of grad students and someone from Tennis Canada, and they looked at Tennis Canada's membership using census data, membership data, and they analyzed it using a program called Tableau, which is free and easy to learn. So I basically replicated that study for Freestyle Canada, which got a lot of attention. So we were able to identify retention rates based on where people sat in the LTAD framework, or coaches, coaching levels, officials, so look at age, gender, where they're coming from. And through that report and using Tableau to communicate that with our provinces and territories and the federal government, we're able to identify what a lot of us are usually aware is that specifically girls around 11 years old opting out earlier than boys. There's a huge drop off from grassroots program to, learn to, or train to train, trained to compete. There was a big problem with the way the programs were delivered. So we did the quantitative analysis, and then we did focus groups and interviews with key stakeholders in each province and territory in French, which, by the way, I was in French immersion and throughout high school, but I had to relearn French essentially for this job. So, and I love working with people in Quebec with the joie de vivre. And then we identified, based on the quantitative research we did and the qualitative interviews, focus groups, and surveys that we did, that our program, which at that time was called Jumps and Bumps, had to change. It wasn't working. It was too complex. So we worked with a group of key stakeholders to redevelop a program called Fundamentals, which was, the whole purpose of it was to make it more fun, fun, inclusive, developmentally appropriate, purposeful, safe, active for people within that stage of the LTAD, with the hopes of having greater athlete retention. And then, but it's not just that, you got to redo the coaching too. So we worked with the Canadian Association of Coaches, implemented that program, and evaluated it and saw that it was having an impact. Now, I left before you could see, generally it takes a couple of years to really see that impact. But that's really what changed my career path and brought me to the Downtown Vancouver Business Improvement Association, that consultation, using kind of conceptualizing what was going on and then informing those decisions with both quantitative data. So it's, I love to keep one foot in the door in sport. So with my volunteer work, and I like to write for the Sport Information Resource Center, CIRC. They do great work over there. And right now, my job is essentially hyper-focused on the pandemic. So I work with a lot of different stakeholders, whether it's economic or social, the city. And what we're doing right now is tracking, like, what are the impacts of the pandemic on the economy and vibrancy of downtown Vancouver. So I do an annual report called the State of Downtown every year. So usually you complete it in around March, and it gets launched in about April, May, June, depending on the timing. So last year's report was terrible timing, because when I finished, I went on vacation, also bad timing, and the pandemic hit. So we had to totally pivot. And so ever since then, we've been really talking with businesses, been literally walking the streets to get a boots on the ground feel of what things are like, counting what businesses are open and closed. Are they independent? Are they chains? How long have they been around? Who's downtown? What are the lifestyle segments that are coming downtown? Cases per 100,000 cases per residence, so on and so forth. And then we publish these reports that have a pretty wide audience. And then, we work to implement change. So whether it's advocating for tax breaks, more social assistance, like a big thing people in the media is people saying crime is up, crime is up. And it is pretty sad if you walk down Granville Street, or main retail district, and the number of people experiencing homelessness on the streets there has skyrocketed. If you asked me a couple of years ago how many needles are in downtown Vancouver any month, I would have thought 500's a lot, but we're talking about 10,000 each quarter. So it's really important for us to not only think of the economy, but also thinking of the people that happen to be living in this area. One of the projects that it's challenging, as you'll see, but is indigenizing data and finding out how many people of color or Indigenous peoples own businesses downtown. And the reality is not many. So that's obviously an issue, a problem. And so why is that? So we'll look into stuff like that. It's been a journey. It's but I think if I was going to give advice to grads, the biggest thing is digital skills training. Learn how to deliver an impactful presentation, and be very confident and concise with your writing, and be able to visualize whatever data you're looking at, whether it's a series of focus groups or surveys or raw data, in a way that the general public can easily understand, because nobody wants to read a 3,000-page policy report.
Thank you, James. That was really helpful. And actually, my question to you was going to be, what advice would you give would you give someone who was a new graduate or new to undergrad and wanted to pursue that pathway? So you definitely answered that, and those are good skills that any graduate should look at having at this point in time, especially post pandemic. I will take this time to open it up to our room and open up for questions.
Can I ask one?
Of course, Vicki.
I think a lot of people feel that they can't live out who they most wish to be. And I would say that you're a person who, even as you listen to your journey, has that, can you hear me? A combination of volunteer and paid positions and choices that have really, in the end, been about who you most want to be. So do you want to speak a bit to how that's directed, the choices you're making? It sounds like you're doing a whole ton of stuff, and again, a lot of volunteer stuff at times. Again, people who think, oh, I have to be very careful about determining and making sure it looks like this and looks like that. You know, I have some volunteer. You're not a person, to me, that tries to strategize so that somebody will hire you. You're somebody that embraces who you want to be, and that's what people see when they go to hire you. So do you want to just comment on that?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really important to have a moral compass and have a good understanding what your values are and what you want to do. And I will admittedly, you know, when I was working in the Canadian sports system, I love sport and that's what I wanted to do, but I wanted to make a bigger impact. You know, I could honestly say now that I'm a little older and maybe very slightly a little bit wiser is, you know, I'm a non-for-profit guy. I'm not about making money for companies. I just want to see people do well. And, you know, the pandemic has really showed me that there's especially at a community sport level, they need a lot of help. You know, like the reality is the Canadian sport is almost entirely dependent on volunteers. And, you could argue that it's starting to be professionalized, but it's not, you know, like you've got moms and dads that have full-time jobs and kids, or they're, you know, or even like people in their, you know, seniors running this. And it's very challenging, especially during the pandemic, to get people together. And so you just have to know what your vision is and your values and where you can help. And that's how I've tried to approach things. And I don't, you know, like I'm not interested working for Deloitte or a developer. So, you know, you can make money off housing or off the office market, which hopefully no one in the office is listening. But that's what's great about working for a nonprofit is you feel like you make a real impact, and generally you link up and you find people that have similar values and passions to you, and it makes it easy to work together. And it's okay to be wrong. And I found it's helpful just kind of to listen to people, and then by listening to people, you have a better idea of how to move forward. I think, Vicki, I learned that from you, being open and I know I learned that from you, being open and listening.
That's great. Thanks, James. And thanks, Vicki. That was a really good question too. Any other questions for James? Questions, comments?
Hey, James.
Hey, Jess.
I really enjoyed your talk. So there's a couple of things that kind of resonated with me. As you probably recall, I teach have for many years until this semester taught our first year sport management course, which is 200 students, many of whom come in wanting to be physiotherapists.
Yeah.
It's probably the number one career path for students coming into kinesiology programs these days. And I'm looking at some of the other names of people who are on this call. They've probably sat through some of those classes and discussions where I said, some of you will end up doing that, but others of you probably won't. At what point did you kind of come to realize that that really wasn't for you? Like, was there an experience? Was there something specific that said, yeah, you know what, I no longer want to do that, and I got to find something else?
Yeah, I learned so much at my time working for a national sport organization, and I really like the camaraderie and the community. But the Canadian sports system at a governance level is really complex, and I wanted to have more of an immediate impact. And I knew I could do that by taking my sport management skills and applying it to a community sports setting. You can make change just like that instead of waiting for years for various levels of government to make a decision. So that kind of hit me like after the Olympics. Generally, in national sport organizations, you have an exodus of staff after an Olympics. People either move on to like own the podium or different agencies, usually event-based agencies, and yeah, so I wanted to make more. That's how I felt. I felt like I was making an impact, but it's really hard, when you're talking to someone in New Brunswick and you just don't know the sense on the feel on the ground, right? You're just trying to implement. For context, I was also responsible for administering insurance, and it's really hard. I was the guy that had to put the rules and compliance in place, and for for New Brunswick, when it's just a group of great parents trying to start up a PSO or enhance, or the Yukon's a really great example, enhance their PSO's capacity entirely volunteer run, you feel, I just felt like I could help to a certain point, but unless I was there, I couldn't do as much. So, and I'll tell you, like, I think the PSO, the provincial sport organizations, are the most impacted by COVID. Their revenues entirely rely on membership fees, which are non-existent, and event fees, plus a little bit of government funding. So, I volunteered with BC Sailing for a bit too, but that's how I felt I could make the biggest impact. And I live in downtown Vancouver, and I have a lot of good memories of it. So that's kind of why I transitioned to downtown. And a lot of, I still report on sports for the downtown Vancouver business. I talk about the impacts of when we host the rugby sevens, and the marathon is a really good example, both the social and economic impacts. So I'm still in sport kind of, but it's just a different, we could give sponsorship to the BMO marathon, dollars, because we know that it brings in this many participants and they're doing this many great things around the community, promote physical activity, so on and so forth. So I thought there's a bigger impact, where PSOs or NSOs really struggle for cash, and a lot of that goes towards their high performance programs.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jess. Any other questions for James?
I have another one. So how do you weave together your academic theoretical ways of understanding the world and your practical experiences?
Oh, that's a great question, because it's something that I often think about. So my thesis, the theoretical framework for the thesis, was strengths and hopes, and underpinned by the duality of structure. So, people are influenced by rules, resources, informal and formal, monetary, interpersonal, personal. And that kind of influenced the way I see the world. And I actually did a talk at a university downtown pre-pandemic about this. And, yeah, like from a strengths and hopes perspective, like I try my best to live my life like that. Granted, it can be very challenging. But I also try with my volunteer work to think about that too, is that everyone's really working towards a common vision because they want something to succeed, and everybody has their own individual strengths. And from a volunteer perspective, I was talking to one of my mentors, and she said, volunteering on a board is an interesting experience because you're just with a bunch of regular people from a wide variety of backgrounds, just trying to work a common goal towards a common goal. And you got to pick out who's good at what, there's some people that are in their 60s that may not necessarily be good at bookkeeping, but they're great at repairing boats. And with my job, it's the exact same thing now. Strength and hope, I think, is more important than anything, especially to change those structures of government that we thought that may have been helping, but are really not. So from a downtown Vancouver perspective, I try and focus on the strengths of not just the wider economy, but the community as well. Draw upon that. I'm sure like it happens in Windsor, like at 7 p.m. To give you a perspective is that downtown Vancouver's resident population is unusually high for a major urban center compared to other cities. And so when the pandemic first hit, a lot of people are in apartment buildings. You've got people clapping at 7 p.m. For healthcare workers. And, like that kind of stuff inspires you. But also to see businesses come together, or various task force or committees come together it could be like a property owner or developer, a small business that runs a little leather shop in a bar, and a giant consultant or something like that, just wanting to work towards, hope is thrown around so much now, towards this common vision. So picking out what the strengths are within downtown Vancouver, so our livability, our vibrancy, strong market fundamentals, our diversity. Vancouver's got a very diverse population, but also acknowledging the challenges that have happened and what are continuing to happen, and it's not super rosy. So how do you leverage those strengths, both at a community level and an economic level, to bring things forward? And it's something that I've recently revisited in the reports that I write now, and to talk about strength and hope. And actually, Vicky, an article I just wrote for CIRC in December, I talked about strength and hope, or it was underpinned by it. I think it's really important because it's so easy to look at a deficit perspective of everything that's wrong with the pandemic and everything that's bad. But if you don't see, everything seems really cloudy, but behind those clouds, there's still a blue sky. And I think it's really important to have that forward-thinking vision, and although it's really challenging, and to recognize the strengths in your community.
They're lucky to have you. And but it's fortunate at a time like a pandemic when it can be so dark. And I think the other thing you said is that they throw the term hope around without really having thought about it, just like a word that doesn't mean a lot. But I think once you've thought a lot about it and the collective approach towards it and stuff, it can make a huge difference. I'm sure that they're really appreciating what you're putting the light on as you look at the pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. And from a research perspective, I learned a lot how to write, and with my thesis, it was a lot of interviews, with what would be deemed as vulnerable populations, and how to respectfully elicit those stories and communicate them. And a lot of those skills transferred over to the grant work I was doing for various organizations. And for an example, when the pandemic happened, for the Sail Club, we're like, it's been around for 25 years. And right before that, our treasurer of 15 years passed away. So it was just an overwhelming experience to a certain extent. And need funding to try and survive. And instead of just asking people, it's great to get a letter of recommendation from parents or your community to support funding. Instead of just asking parents, can you write a letter of recommendation? Because some people don't know what to write, or maybe that's not their strength. Is I interviewed them. And then I said, on your behalf, can I, I'll write it up based on our conversation. I'll send it to you. Let me know this is good or not. And those letters were quite impactful, and it really helped with our succession planning and recruiting new volunteers, because people had a really good understanding of how impactful this local community sailing clubs programs were. When we initially announced that we were closing down programs, people were upset, they were pissed off. And the same thing happened at Whistler Adaptive Sports. And you just realize that how much that means to people. That's their identity in certain cases. But being able to capture that is really powerful, whether you're in a professional setting and you're communicating an idea, or I I guess, for applying for grants.
Thanks for that, James. Thank you, Vicki. Any other questions or comments for James?
Well, that's one other thing, because I was thinking about this recently,
Sure.
is that for my thesis defense, Andrew Templer, who's from the Odette School of Business, was on my committee. And one of the questions he asked me was from a business perspective for this program for adaptive sailing in Toronto. How would you promote it? You know, what is the return on investment for corporate sponsorship or you know, a grant or whatever? And I don't think I, at the time, answered it very well, but I could tell you, like, there's a huge return on investment for that. You know, you're strengthening those community ties. You're not just leaving people out in the dark. And this is super important because in Toronto, they're thinking of redeveloping that area where the Queen's Quay Disabled Sailing Association is located. So getting rid of that waterfront and putting housing there. So the question is, for the greater good, does that matter? You know, is it gonna produce more affordable housing, you know, whatever? But the impact on that community of people who have been there since 1999 is tremendous. And so that's something I'm thinking of revisiting to lobby. But it's important to capture those stories because it impacts people's lives. And people get job training skills from these types of programs. That's whole Whistler Adaptive's kind of mandate, is to not only build people up, you know, psychologically and mentally, but give them the skills they need, the problem solving skills, and both volunteers and participants to contribute back to their communities.
Well, thank you, James. That's very insightful and valuable. And we appreciate that, the way you're able to weave in all of your experiences. And I'm excited to have you here because I think that we haven't had a lot of speakers who have really touched on the importance of community work, the way that you've been able to shed light on it, and the importance of those grassroots programs. And you know, you've spoke a lot about important work that you've done in the communities and getting down on the streets and connecting with people and seeing what motivates them and seeing what is meaningful in their lives and how sport contributes to that. And I think that's something that not a lot of undergrads think about. They don't think about how they can have an impact in that way. So thank you for telling us about that. And I hope that you've inspired some undergrads to broaden the scope beyond physical therapy and think about what they can do to have a greater impact on the community too, other than therapies. So thank you for that. And we've already asked for your permission to post this, so thanks for allowing us to do that. And I will pass along your contact to our students as well, should we have any that I'm sure we'll have some who want to ask questions later.
Yeah, of course.
All right. Well, thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day and make sure you keep in touch. Let us know what you're up to.
Thanks.
Thanks,
for having me.
James.
Thanks, James.